My brother showed up unannounced, fists clenched, dragging me back into the violence I thought I'd escaped. I'm not even sure where to start with this story, but here it goes. It feels surreal just typing it out, and I can't decide if I'm looking for advice or if I just need a place to release it all. I've carried this weight around for so long, and if I'm honest, it's starting to wear me down. I've never told anyone the full story, not even my closest friends, because who wants to believe that life could be this messed up? But maybe if I write it all down, I can make sense of it somehow. I grew up in a tiny town. One of those places where everyone seems to know everything about you, except apparently what's happening behind closed doors. My father, Michael, was an angry man and an even angrier drinker. And it always felt like he had to unleash that anger somewhere. If his day at work was rough or my mom didn't prepare his favorite dinner, somehow I ended up being the target. It was never fair, but at the time I thought that's just how life was. He'd say things like, "You're lazy, you're worthless," and other things that no one should ever hear, especially from a parent. And honestly, it was the words, not the physical hits, that hurt the most. My mom, Sarah, was there physically, but I can't say she was present in any real way. She drifted through her days in a haze of smoke, alcohol, and daytime TV. She wasn't physically abusive like my dad, but she was indifferent. Every time I tried to talk to her, she'd just wave me off, saying I was being dramatic. She didn't care to hear about my pain, my struggles, or even my achievements. It was like I didn't exist. The only person who seemed to care was my Aunt Eva. She was my mom's younger sister and the only family member who took any interest in my life. Aunt Eva wasn't perfect, but she was my rock, my refuge. She was everything my parents weren't: kind, patient, and genuinely interested in me. Every month or so, she'd take me to her place for the weekend, and those days with her felt like a safe haven. We'd go out for ice cream, she'd ask me about school, and she actually listened. For years, I secretly wished I could just live with her. I felt like everything would be okay if I could just stay with Aunt Eva. But my parents made it very clear that it was never going to happen. One night, I overheard my dad saying that Eva was too soft on me, that I needed toughening up. That night, I realized that my parents didn't care about me, not really. They only saw me as something to mold into their twisted idea of strength. As I got older, I realized that even though my house was toxic, I could at least find a small escape at school. But school was a strange mix of freedom and torment. Sure, it got me away from my parents for a few hours, but I didn't fit in. I didn't have any friends. I was the quiet kid who sat at the back, hoping to be invisible. I'd see other kids laughing and hanging out, and it felt like I was watching a different world. The bullying started around 5th grade. I was small, awkward, and didn't know how to interact with people. There was this one kid, Daniel, who took it upon himself to make my life miserable. He'd trip me in the hallway, shove me, call me names. I remember one day, he knocked my books out of my hands, and as I scrambled to pick them up, he sneered, "No wonder your parents hate you." His words hit harder than any push or shove. I didn't know how he knew, but somehow he did. It was around the age of 12 that I started to realize something was seriously wrong in my family. One night, my dad came home drunk. More drunk than usual. I could hear him yelling from my room, then dishes breaking as he stormed around the house. The sound of my mom's voice, pleading with him to stop, filled me with dread. I stayed in my room hoping he'd forget about me. But he didn't. The door to my room flew open, and there he was, towering over me with a wild look in his eyes. "You think you're better than me?" he slurred, stumbling toward me. I couldn't respond, paralyzed by fear. He grabbed my shirt, pulled me up, and slapped me so hard I saw stars. I remember hitting the floor and thinking, this is it. He's going to kill me. But he didn't. He just stormed out, leaving me on the floor, shaking and trying to breathe. That night, I started counting down the days until I could leave for good. High school wasn't any easier. The bullying, the isolation, it all followed me. But I focused on surviving. I knew that if I wanted any chance to escape, I had to keep my grades up. It was my ticket out, the only path that didn't lead back to my parents. Thankfully, Aunt Eva remained my lifeline. She'd figured out that something was very wrong, even though I never told her the full extent. She tried talking to my mom, but nothing ever changed. Instead, Eva kept encouraging me, telling me I could get out if I worked hard enough. She made me believe that maybe I wasn't worthless after all. Then one day I got an acceptance letter to a university. I couldn't believe it. I was getting out. My parents' reactions? Typical. My dad scoffed, saying college was a waste of time. My mom barely looked up from her cigarette. But I didn't care. I was leaving, and that was all that mattered to me. My first day on campus was overwhelming. I didn't know anyone, but for the first time I felt a strange mix of fear and freedom. Nobody there knew about my past, about the nightmare I was leaving behind. I could just be myself, whoever that was. It felt like a weight had been lifted. But even though I was finally out, the damage was already done. I had no idea how to connect with people. I'd spent my entire life trying to be invisible, and now that I didn't have to, I didn't know how to be seen. I kept to myself, focusing on my studies and keeping up appearances. For once, it felt like things might be okay. Then, during my second year, I got a call that turned my world upside down. It was Aunt Eva. She was crying, which I'd never heard before. My dad had been in a serious car accident. He'd been drinking, of course, and had driven into a tree. He was in critical condition. I didn't know how to feel. Part of me wanted to be relieved, but there was another part of me, a small, twisted part, that still felt something for him. After all, he was my dad. Despite everything he'd put me through, I couldn't shake the connection. So, I went to the hospital not because I wanted to, but because I felt like I had to. When I walked in, my mom was sitting in the waiting room looking more annoyed than upset. She barely glanced at me. "He's in surgery," she said flatly. That was it. No emotion, no acknowledgement. Just another day in her world. When the doctor finally came out, he told us that my dad had survived but was in a coma. I sat there, staring at the floor, trying to understand what I was supposed to feel. Relief? Guilt? Rage? I didn't know, and I still don't. But that day was a turning point, the beginning of something new, even if I didn't see it at the time. I left off at my dad's accident. That day stirred up feelings I didn't even realize I had, and even now, it's hard to understand it all. But if you're ready, let's dive back in. So, with my dad in a coma, life took on this strange new rhythm. I tried to focus on my studies, but it was like my brain couldn't keep up. I'd sit in class, my mind wandering back to that hospital waiting room, my mom sitting there with her usual indifference, the doctors murmuring about my dad's slim chances. It was a mix of freedom and guilt, and I couldn't shake it. Then Aunt Eva suggested I move in with her permanently. When she said it, I almost laughed out loud. It seemed like such a simple solution to a complicated mess, but it also felt like the first real escape I'd ever been offered. In that moment, I realized just how done I was with the life my parents had built around me. I packed my things and left without looking back. I didn't even tell my mom. I just left her a note and left. Eva and I drove away from that town, leaving behind all the ghosts, or so I thought. We moved to a small city where no one knew us, and that anonymity was exactly what I needed. We rented a modest one-bedroom apartment with Eva's savings and what little I had left from student loans. I had to drop out of university for now, but it felt like a fair trade for a new start. I found a job at a local marketing firm. Nothing fancy, but it was work. At first, I was just there for the paycheck, but as time went on, I realized I was good at it. My years of watching from the sidelines, of reading people's moods and intentions, were coming in handy. Within a few months, I was promoted to junior account manager, and for the first time I felt something close to pride. Eva found a job as a teacher's aide. She loved working with kids, and every day she'd come home with new stories and a smile on her face. Seeing her happy made me happy, and I knew we were building something together. It wasn't the life I'd imagined, but it was ours, and that felt good. Around this time I met someone. Her name was Grace. We'd see each other in the elevator sometimes since she worked in the same building but for a different company. She had this quiet confidence that pulled me in. One day I finally worked up the nerve to ask her out for coffee. I'd never really dated before, so I was awkward and unsure, but somehow she didn't seem to mind. We started seeing each other regularly, going from coffee dates to dinners, and eventually we were spending almost all of our free time together. Grace was unlike anyone I'd ever known. She was grounded, calm, and had this ability to see the good in people, even me, which was still hard to believe. For the first time I felt like I could relax, like I could trust someone. It was strange, but it felt right. One Friday night we were at the grocery store grabbing some snacks for a movie night, when I impulsively grabbed a lottery ticket. I didn't think much of it at the time. It was just one of those why not moments. We went back to my place, watched our movie, and I completely forgot about the ticket until the next morning. I woke up to find Grace staring at the TV, her face pale. She held up the ticket, her hands shaking, and whispered, "We won." It didn't register at first. I laughed, thinking she was joking, but then I saw the numbers flashing on the screen. We'd won the jackpot. $1 million. That moment felt like a dream, the kind where you're waiting for reality to kick in. After a long day of calling the lottery commission, filling out forms, and trying to understand what had just happened, we finally started to believe it was real. But as exciting as it was, I was cautious. I'd heard horror stories about people blowing their winnings and ending up worse off than they started, so I decided to get some professional advice. After some research, I found a financial advisor named Marcus who came highly recommended. He walked me through everything: taxes, investments, and setting up a long-term plan. In the end, after taxes and fees, we had about $850,000 left. Not exactly $1 million, but still more than I'd ever thought I'd have. Marcus helped me put most of it into safe investments, with a small portion set aside for riskier ventures. I set up a savings account, an emergency fund, and for the first time I felt financially secure. It was a surreal feeling knowing I wouldn't have to scrape by worrying about every dollar. But I was also careful not to let the money change me. I didn't want it to define me. Then just when life seemed stable, it all started to unravel again. One night, Grace and I were sitting in my living room talking about the future, when she told me she wanted to take some time apart. Her words blindsided me. I thought we were happy. We had money, a future that felt secure, and I was finally starting to believe I was worth something. But Grace said the money had changed things. She felt like we were moving in different directions, that I was becoming someone she didn't recognize. She packed her things and left the next day, and I was left staring at the empty space where she'd been. Her departure hurt, but this time I didn't spiral. I wasn't the same scared kid who'd tiptoed around his dad's temper, nor the invisible teenager hiding from the world. I had built a life for myself, and I wasn't going to let this break me. I threw myself into work, took on new projects, and even started consulting for small startups on the side. My career was thriving, and I was climbing the ladder faster than I'd expected. Eva was there for me through it all. She was proud of me, and seeing her pride helped fill the gap that Grace had left. Eventually, Eva and I decided to buy a house. Nothing extravagant, just a modest home in a quiet neighborhood. It was the first real home I'd ever had, a place that felt safe and stable. We'd built this life together, and I was proud of that. A few months after Grace left, life had settled into a routine again. I felt like I was finally on track. But then one Thursday afternoon I got a phone call that threw me off balance. I was in the middle of a client meeting when my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number, but something told me to pick up. "Hello," I answered, and after a long pause, a voice I barely recognized said, "It's Brandon." Brandon. My half-brother. He was my dad's son from an earlier relationship, and we hadn't grown up together. We'd met a few times when I was young, but those encounters were brief and awkward. He'd always seemed angry, resentful, like he held some grudge against me that I couldn't understand. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm in town. We need to talk," he said. There was something in his voice that put me on edge. He didn't ask, he demanded. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him for coffee the next day, thinking it would be a quick catch-up at most. But when I opened my front door the next morning, there he was, standing on my porch without invitation, a glint of something dark in his eyes. "Brandon," I said, caught off guard. "I thought we were meeting at the cafe?" He shrugged and stepped inside without waiting for me to invite him in. His gaze swept over the house and he sneered. "So, this is what you've done with your life? Living off Dad's money, huh?" I felt my stomach twist. "What are you talking about? I bought this house with my own money." He scoffed, his face twisting with anger. "You think you're better than me, don't you? Think you're someone special because you got lucky. Well, you're not. And I'm not leaving until I get what I deserve." The tension in the room was thick, and I felt a wave of dread. "Brandon, this house isn't yours. It has nothing to do with Dad. This is my home." But before I could react, he lunged at me, his fist catching me off guard. I stumbled backward, trying to regain my footing, but he was relentless. And then I saw it, a glint of brass in his hand. Brass knuckles. He had come prepared. The blows came fast, each one sharper than the last. I tried to defend myself, but Brandon was bigger, angrier, fueled by a rage I couldn't understand. Each punch sent waves of pain through my body until finally I collapsed, barely conscious. Through the haze, I heard a voice, Aunt Eva, standing at the door, her phone in hand, screaming, "Stop. I'm calling the police." Brandon froze, his face twisted with fury, and then he bolted out the door. The next thing I knew, paramedics were lifting me onto a stretcher, and Eva was by my side, holding my hand, her face pale with fear. That night left scars I'd never expected, both physical and emotional. So if you're ready, here's what happened next. After Brandon fled, the police found him holed up in a rundown motel on the edge of town. He didn't put up a fight, and within hours he was arrested and taken into custody. But while he was safely behind bars, the ordeal was far from over for me. I was rushed to the hospital, where doctors treated me for broken ribs, a fractured jaw, and internal bruising. They told me that without Aunt Eva's quick call to 911, things could have ended much worse. I spent days in the hospital recovering from my injuries. Aunt Eva stayed by my side, refusing to leave, but I could see the worry in her eyes every time the doctors came to check on me. The physical pain was intense, but honestly, it was the emotional weight that hurt more. The realization that Brandon, my own brother, had wanted to hurt me, maybe even kill me. That kind of betrayal isn't easy to process. The day before I was discharged, a detective came by to get my statement. Recounting the attack was like reliving it, but I managed to get through it. I told them everything. How Brandon had shown up unannounced, how he demanded that I give him what he deserved, and how he turned violent when I refused. The detective was calm and professional, but I could tell he'd seen situations like this before. "Family," he said quietly when I finished. "Sometimes they're the ones who hurt us the most." Brandon's trial started a few weeks after I was released from the hospital. I'd never imagined I'd be sitting in a courtroom watching my own brother face charges for assault, but there I was. Brandon sat across from me, stone-faced, not looking at me once. It was eerie seeing him there, so close yet so distant. He didn't say a word, just listened as the prosecution laid out the evidence. Aunt Eva's testimony, the bruises, the brass knuckles they'd found in his bag when he was arrested. The trial didn't last long. The evidence was clear, and the jury reached a quick verdict. Brandon was found guilty of aggravated assault, and the judge sentenced him to several years in prison. I thought I'd feel relief, maybe even satisfaction. But all I felt was empty. This was my brother, someone who should have been family, and now he was just another stranger who'd hurt me. It was a hard truth to swallow, but I knew I had to accept it. After the trial, Aunt Eva and I returned to the house. Walking through the door, I felt a wave of anxiety wash over me. Every corner of the room held a memory of the attack, of Brandon's rage, of the fear that had gripped me. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow still there, lurking in the shadows. But Eva was there, always a steady presence, helping me through every step. Together we made small changes. Rearranged furniture, repainted walls. We transformed the space so it felt like ours again, a place of safety rather than fear. Work became my escape. My colleagues, many of whom had heard about the incident, were supportive, giving me the space to recover but also helping me stay grounded. I threw myself into projects, grateful for the distraction. Slowly, I started to feel a sense of normalcy return, like I could finally put this chapter behind me. Then, 6 months after the attack, I got a phone call that I never saw coming. The number was unfamiliar, and when I answered, the voice on the other end introduced herself as Dr. Lin from a hospital back in my hometown. "I'm calling about your father," she said. My heart skipped a beat. My father, the man who had shaped so much of my pain. I had convinced myself he was never going to wake up from his coma, that I'd left that part of my life behind. "He's regained consciousness," the doctor continued. Her words hit me like a freight train. My father was awake. After all these years, after everything I'd been through, he was back. I didn't know what to say, so I thanked her and hung up, sitting in stunned silence. 1,000 questions raced through my mind. What did he remember? How would he react to seeing me again? Could he change, or would he still be the same man who'd terrorized my childhood? I struggled with the decision, but eventually I knew I had to go. I told Aunt Eva, who offered to come with me, but I felt like this was something I needed to do alone. Walking back into that hospital, memories flooded over me. The sterile smell, the fluorescent lights. It all took me back to the nights I'd spent dreading my father's return home, wondering if he'd be in one of his moods. When I walked into his room, I barely recognized him. Big, small, frail. The man who had once seemed so powerful and terrifying was now lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to machines, his skin pale. But when he looked up and saw me, his eyes flickered with recognition. And then a familiar hardness. "Look who decided to show up," he croaked, his voice a harsh rasp. The bitterness in his tone took me off guard. I'd thought maybe, just maybe, he'd be different, that the coma might have softened him. But the anger was still there, simmering just below the surface. "Dad," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I had dreamed about this moment for years, but standing there, I was suddenly speechless. Part of me had expected an apology, or at least some kind of acknowledgement of what he'd put me through. But instead he sneered. "Now you want to call me Dad? After everything?" He chuckled, but it was hollow, bitter. All the anger, the resentment I'd kept bottled up for years, suddenly bubbled over. "You were never a dad to me," I said, my voice steady. "You ruined my childhood. Made me feel worthless. And now you want me to pretend like none of that happened?" For a moment I thought he might finally show some remorse, but he just shook his head, muttering, "You were always weak. Couldn't even handle a little discipline." That was it. The last straw. I felt a calm anger settle over me, and I looked him dead in the eye. "Goodbye, Michael." He looked taken aback, his expression shifting to something that almost resembled fear, but I didn't stay to see it. I turned and walked out, leaving him to whatever fate had in store. I thought I'd feel some sort of closure, but instead it just felt empty. The truth was, I'd never get the apology, the acknowledgement, or the peace I'd hoped for. But maybe that was okay. Maybe, finally, I could start letting go. A few days later, Aunt Eva called with news about my mom. Apparently, she'd been spiraling even further after I'd left, spending most of her days drunk or high. But what really shook me was that she had been telling everyone in our old town that I'd abandoned her, that I owed her money, and that I was the reason her life had fallen apart. I felt a mix of anger and sadness. She'd never protected me, never cared for me, and now she was twisting the story to paint herself as the victim. Eva suggested I go see her, just to confront her once and for all. I wasn't sure if I was ready, but something in me knew that I needed to close this chapter too. When I got to my mom's house, it was a wreck. Trash littered the yard, and the place looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. I knocked on the door, and after a minute she opened it. She looked worse than I'd ever seen. Bloodshot eyes, disheveled hair, reeking of alcohol. For a moment I wondered if she even recognized me. "Oh, look who decided to show up," she slurred, leaning against the doorframe. Her words stung, but I wasn't going to let her guilt trip me. "Mom, we need to talk," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Talk? About what?" she scoffed. "You left. Ran off with your fancy money, left me here to rot." Her words hit hard, but I took a deep breath. "I didn't abandon you. You were never there for me, not once. You let Dad abuse me and you did nothing. You can't blame me for the choices you made." She swayed, her face twisted in anger. "Abuse? He was making you tough. You were always too soft, always crying." Hearing her defend him was like a slap in the face, but this time I didn't back down. "He wasn't toughening me up. He was destroying me, and you let him. You had the chance to protect me, but you chose not to." For a moment I thought she might argue back, but instead she just laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "Go ahead, walk away. You're just like him." Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving her and all the pain she represented behind. It wasn't the closure I'd wanted, but it was enough. I had faced her, spoken my truth, and now I could finally start to heal. After that encounter, something in me shifted. I had spent years haunted by my parents, by their cruelty and neglect, but now I felt a strange sense of peace. They would never change, and I couldn't fix them. But I could heal. I could build a life free from their shadow. Eva and I took a trip to the coast, rented a little cabin by the beach, and spent days walking along the shore, talking, laughing, and just enjoying life. For the first time in years, I felt truly free.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, please like, share, and subscribe to StorySpins for more great stories.